North America is kind of an enigma to the world and even to ourselves. It's strange that America is unquestionably the world's cultural hegemon, but most non-Americans have kind of faint cultural understandings of how America really is. They know there are cowboys in Texas, mafia in New York, and Hollywood, but they don't understand the history and culture behind the country. Even internally, North Americans often know shockingly little about other areas of the country outside of their own. It's funny to people in both red and blue states that they treat each other as dangerous wastelands, but in reality, both red and blue states are wealthy, forward-thinking, and really livable societies. There's a good answer for all of this, in that North America is divided by 9 cultural regions that go across state or national borders and act as their own units, but often lack self-consciousness. North America isn't like Europe, where if a cultural area exists, it must build a political identity and fight wars to maintain its survival. Americans can just kind of exist and do what they want without thinking about it. In 1980, the journalist Joel Garreau wrote a book called The Nine Nations of North America, in which he traveled around the continent explaining how each different sub-area of America operated at the time. This model has since become really popular, since I would just say it does a great job of explaining how the continent works. 40 years later, I would say these borders are still exactly where he put them, and all these nations really stand for the same things. Joel did a much better job than I would have at constructing these areas and what their borders are. However, Nine Nations of North America as a book is a lot of ways limited. It was only looking at how these nations existed at the very moment it was written in 1980, but each of these regions has a deep history and a future that happened afterwards. I don't fault Joel Garreau for not covering this, since first of all, he's not a wizard who can predict the future, but at the same time, he was a journalist, not a historian, and he didn't set out to do what we're doing here. And the point of this video is to have a deep look into these areas, explaining them for people who aren't familiar with them in the first place, but also going through their histories, cultures, geographies, and more. My goal is to treat each of these nations with the same respect that you would treat, say, a European country, looking into their social structure, economic systems, history, hatreds, and all that other stuff. And I want to do it in as frank and honest a way as possible. An important point to make here is what a nation is. A nation is an area of cultural unity and identity. It doesn't have to do with politics. Politics is the state. And you do have nation states, like the ethnicity of French people corresponds to the borders of the nation of France. But also you have places like Scotland or Kurdistan who have very clear ethnic identities, yet at the same time, they're not politically independent. These different areas of America share cultures, geographies, economic systems, and basically everything. Once you know which of these nations an American is from, it's pretty easy to predict many of their ideas, views, likes, dislikes, etc. Americans as a society purposely underplay regionalism, since America has been a country that's unified from a series of regional states, and thus the American cultural and educational system talks about regionalism way, way less than would really give it justice, because Americans are still trying to unify a unwieldy, very large country and prevent the centripetal forces of division that could tear it apart. And America is in many ways a cookie-cutter society, in that at the exterior it looks very similar across the continent, in that you'll see the same kinds of hotel rooms or the same fast food chains, or Americans around the country now talk with often the same accent. But if you start to probe a little, you'll find massive regional differences in stuff that really matters, like how people think, act, react, and everything else. This video will break against the myth of American unity that Americans cherish so much. Now let's get started in our tour of the 9 nations of North America, going clockwise. The United States may be regionally divided, but it coalesces into a unified force that is the most powerful nation on the planet. Stretching back from Benjamin Franklin until the present, and much further geographically than from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, for better or for worse, the US exerts tremendous influence. I watched a fascinating documentary about this on Magellan TV named America's Diplomats. This looks at the power brokers inside the United States' foreign policy for its history. It looks at how America's diplomats today affect the world, and how they're facing greater strains as well due to greater international tensions. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming service made by filmmakers with the best selection of movies and historical documentaries out there. They have content covering everything from the ancient world to current events and from true crime to astronomy. Magellan's compatible with just about any device and is 4K HD with no additional cost. It's a great platform for an affordable price. Regardless of what your interests are, Magellan TV has something for you, be it science, history, philosophy, or anything else. Magellan TV is a great platform, so check out Magellan today and start learning about whatever interests you. What If Altist viewers can also get a 1-month free trial using the link in the video description. Number 1. New England. Of all the North American cultures, New England was the one that was most consciously created, because it largely was. New England is in ways that we will break down the American region that's culturally most similar to Europe, and is also the region that really was an ethno-state until fairly recently. New England was inhabited by a single population who came from the same ancestral roots, believed the same things, and acted the same. These were the Puritans. The ancestors of most old-stock New Englanders came over in a 20-year period from 1621 to 1641. It was organized by a handful of Puritan preachers in England, John Winthrop being the most notable, who were reacting to how the government of the time in England was an Anglican oligarchy that oppressed their religion. The idea was to create a New England as a utopia, to be, as Winthrop said, a city on the hill, that the rest of the world would emulate. However, their religion was Puritanism, possibly the most strict interpretation of Christianity ever. The Puritans believed it really wasn't under our control whether or not we went to hell, and that it was a divine lottery in which only a handful were saved. Their interpretation of Christianity was extremely strict, banning holidays, dancing, music, recreational activities, and they even viewed relaxing as sinful, thinking one should always be working. When they were in control of New England's legislatures, they banned celebrating Christmas, arguing with your wife too loudly, lounging about, not attending church, where the services were 6 hours long, mind you, as well as fornication, of course. This was a cult-like society in which all your neighbors were permanently watching you, seeing if you'd come up short. It's pretty normal in Puritan accounts to see people have periodic emotional life crises attached to psychological collapses at feeling they weren't doing a good job of getting into heaven. The pulpit in Puritan churches had a giant painted eye of God that would watch the congregation. The Puritans came from a very particular social set in England. Most came from an area of eastern England called East Anglia, and the vast majority were middle class, working in various jobs like merchants, carpenters, small farmers, and the like. And they were entirely English. This group migrated to New England in a 20-year period, and then for the next 200 years, excluded any other immigrants. This population that ascended to the Puritans are called Yankees. Due to their success, non-Americans refer to all Americans as Yankees, but the closer you get to New England, the smaller and smaller a category it is. New England's a rocky peninsula that fronts the North Atlantic with awful soil. Taking this artisan class from England, possibly the most developed country in the world, and putting them in this harsh geography created the classic Yankee ingenuity, thrift, and mechanical ability that's famous. The Industrial Revolution in America started in New England, partially, and this area competes with England for a region that's made the most inventions in human history, with Yankees being the best builders and mechanics in the world. The rivers of New England were filled with sawmills, factories, shipyards, and the like. The New Englanders were absolutely remarkable traders and merchants. They were strong presences in the Atlantic slave trade, selling slaves from Africa to the Caribbean and the South. They were the South's dominant merchant class in much of the 19th century, and there were New England pirates raiding India operating off the island of Madagascar in the 18th century. New England whalers sailed around the bottom of South America to hunt whales and sea otters for fur in the North Pacific. And Hawaii was in many ways a New England colony during the 19th century. The Atlantic provinces of Canada were settled by New Englanders, and before the American Revolution were economically dependent upon Boston. Being a colt came with many social advantages, the top one being conformity. From 1600 to 1850, New England would have scored as the highest place in the world on almost any statistic. This area had possibly the lowest inequality of any developed society since there was no underclass, since the religion forced everyone to work. It was possibly also the wealthiest society in the world, as well as the most technologically advanced, and had the highest literacy, educational attainment, and the pre-modern world's Human Development Index of anywhere on the planet. The ruling class in New England have been unironically called Brahmins, like the dominant priest class in India, since New England has traditionally been a theocracy. The Puritans had a very intellectual branch of Christianity, and the Puritans dominated England's universities at the time, and they educated their clergy a lot. America's top universities are extremely concentrated in this area. This region is extremely disproportionate in its education and technological development today. Boston is by all accounts a pretty small city, at half the size of my home city of Philadelphia. with less than 1 million people, but Boston is much more famous and influential than its size should allow by basically being America's brain. In New England, we've seen religion vanish over time. The Puritans went too hard in the beginning, and there was a backlash, and now this is by far the least religious part of America by a really big margin. However, the New Englanders kept their fundamental character. They hold on to the Puritan belief that they're the center of the universe and have a sense of moral crusading that they try to push onto the rest of America. Some of these movements have been positive, like ending slavery, creating public schools or gay rights, while others, like economic planning, prohibiting alcohol, or critical race theory, have been negative. Boston tries to spring its harebrained schemes onto the rest of the country. The South always opposes them, and if New England can convince the middle states, it'll take over the country. An important and interesting thing to consider is that America's public school system, as well as secondarily its bureaucracy, were built by New England Yankees. And with the educational system, a lot of cultural assumptions that came from Puritan culture went into it in a way, as the New Englanders thought, to civilize their own Catholic lower classes and the rest of the country. And so a lot of stuff like emphasis on group sports, waking up early, regimentation, and doing things very precisely, fixing people up for industrial jobs. And a very interesting thing is that in a lot of old American histories, they give the New Englanders far, far greater emphasis than they really deserve in the creation of the country. And so it's why America's founding myth, the Mayflower and Thanksgiving, is built around the settlement of Massachusetts. And in a lot of World War II histories, they treat the origin of America's identity as the Puritans, even though the Puritans were one of many English groups that had roughly equal impact upon American society. The benefits of New England are how dynamic and smart the culture is, while the downsides are how arrogant and cold it is, for lack of a better term. In polls, this part of the country tends to be the most hated by the other areas, since people view New Englanders as cold, antisocial jerks who view the rest of the country with immense condescension. I went to college in Maine for a semester, and I just walk up to people and start talking to them, which is just polite and friendly in Pennsylvania, but apparently it was really weird in New England. My family's not originally from New England, but I have lots of relatives that moved there, and they say the locals are totally unwilling to socialize or befriend people who weren't born and raised in the local area. Due to its peripheral, frigid geography and cold, antisocial culture, New England has been shedding people and influence to the rest of the country since the time of the American Revolution. People have been leaving New England for states further south and west for 300 years. These immigrants never really bring a lot of Yankee culture either, assimilating to friendlier cultures in other parts of the country. New England's weird for deindustrializing so early. To put it in other words, New England factories were shutting down at the time of the U.S. Civil War due to competition in the Midwest and Middle states, and the area was in a massive economic recession by the 1920s. The New England countryside used to be all farms, but now the vast majority of New England is forested, since in the 19th century, people left for the fertile fields in the Midwest, leaving the forests of New England with lots of abandoned stone houses and fences. Starting in the 19th century, you saw the erosion of the Yankee ethno-state. New England saw waves of Catholic immigrants such as Irish, Italians, Portuguese, and French Canadians. The Irish especially predominated, in many ways becoming a dominant culture in Boston. Unlike the Middle States, the New Englanders didn't have a way to assimilate these immigrants, who lived in factory ghettos away from the Yankees. They were basically two different races until the middle of the 20th century, when the immigrants eventually assimilated. However, some didn't even assimilate. As an Irish American, I was so shocked that there are still Irish neighborhoods in Boston of people who identified as predominantly Irish today, since I view Ireland as so distant, and all the Irish people in the rest of the country are very assimilated. New England is divided between two regions today, the educated cities and the rest. Due to the rise of the intelligence economy, New England was able to prosper like nowhere else, since it had the best universities and was an intellectual hub. Boston's a world hub of tech, finance, and intellectual jobs, and is incredibly wealthy. However, at the same time, the other New England was extremely poor. In fact, one of the poorest places in the country, since outside of academia, New England's can't compete with the rest of the country. Some of the most disheartening places I've seen in all of America are the old New England mill towns and New England rural areas. Without the Puritan religion that was the bedrock of community, with the factories gone, and with the most enterprising inhabitants leaving for centuries, you've seen social collapse in much of New England. There's a reason all three of America's top horror writers are from New England. New England remains today the land of Stephen King, while its scientists are to propel man to the stars. Number 2, the Foundry. This is my home region. I've moved many times in my life, but this is the area I've spent almost all of my life in, and I understand it on a really intimate level because of that. This area of the country is in many ways really depressing, and growing up with its decline has smashed my character in a very profound way. The Foundry, as Joel Garreau called it in 1980, but has since become better known as the Rust Belt, is an area that encapsulates the Middle Atlantic and Great Lakes region. Joel Garreau had several cities that were entirely surrounded by the Rust Belt, but he considered to be culturally distinct, and I agree, and I added a third. Those cities being New York City, Washington, D.C., and Toronto. And I'm going to cover that in the city-state section of the next video. But these are cities that have very different trajectories and honestly demographics than the rest of the Rust Belt that makes them distinct enough. Joel thought that the suburbs of these cities would have counted as the Foundry, and I think that was true back then, but due to cultural shifts, I'd say they're now a boundary zone, where the New York suburbs are halfway between being a normal part of the Foundry and halfway an extension of New York. It used to be by far the wealthiest place in the world. At the end of World War II, this area was a quarter of the whole world's economy. The largest manufacturing center in the world was here. The Port of Philadelphia was the largest shipbuilding center in the world. Detroit, the largest car manufacturer, Pittsburgh, the largest steel manufacturer, Newark, New Jersey, the largest port, and you could go on for about 20 others. The population power of this area also used to be insane. At the time of the U.S. Civil War, 1/3 of the whole country's population were in the states of Ohio, New York, and Pennsylvania. Using my home state of Pennsylvania as indicative of this area's former power and later decline. At the time of World War II, Pennsylvania was the state with the most industry in the whole country, the second richest state in total GDP, the second most populous state, and Philadelphia was the third largest city in America, ahead of Los Angeles. However, all of this is gone now. Growing up in Pennsylvania, manufacturing is totally gone. I walked past what used to be the largest shipyard in America on my way to school, and I didn't see a single ship pass for years. In Pennsylvania, entire countrysides and areas of cities are wastelands. Philadelphia has a smaller population today than it did in 1950, while the total country's population has more than doubled. And to be honest, half the city is off limits for white people if you don't want to get shot. Philly went from being one of the richest cities in the whole world to being the poorest and the most crime-filled of America's top 10 largest cities. The whole north and center of Pennsylvania is filled with rotting factories with little or no jobs. Pennsylvania has the highest total amount of opioid overdoses of any state, including states with much larger populations like California or Texas, since the opioids became a way to deal with the pain of deindustrialization. When people were really confused why anyone voted for Trump, and especially this area of the country, it was just totally obvious to me. This was an area of the country with a population larger than Germany's, which had seen its pride and livelihood taken away within living memory, and no one before Trump would ever talk about it. Left-wingers treat it as if it's something they can wave away, and all the folks screwed of white privilege, which is just even more infuriating to this area's inhabitants. This results in mass rage and a shift to the right, since at least Trump will listen to them. I guess the broader question is, why did this region rise to such worldwide predominance and then fall so fast and hard? Something to keep in mind is that, like New England, the Foundry is kind of like a European country, in that there was a dominant ethnic group that was almost all the population back in the day. This was the Anglo population, in that almost all people here until the middle of the 19th century were Protestants of Northwestern European ancestry. This group has maintained its cultural majority and has done a great job of assimilating later immigrants, unlike New England. For example, I would consider myself completely culturally Anglo, but I'm half Irish Catholic. I have friends that are of Hispanic or partial Asian ancestry that I would consider to be culturally indistinguishable from the British Protestant American original settlers. The American melting pot started in this area. The two cultural areas of this region during the colonial period were New York and Pennsylvania. I'll cover New York City in another section. In a lot of ways, it's very different from the rest of the Foundry, but Pennsylvania was an incredibly different cultural context than New England. Pennsylvania was settled by Quakers from northern England in the 17th century, who were a fanatical Protestant sect, but believed in the opposite things of the other fanatical sect, the Puritans. Interestingly, and not coincidentally, the people who settled America's Rust Belt came from England's Rust Belt, and at the time they were known for being individualistic, freedom-loving, and rowdy. I was raised a Quaker, and Quaker church services where you sit in groups together and meditate without priests or ceremonies. And if you feel the will of God move through you, you speak to the group. Quakers don't believe in hierarchy ceremony and think all people have the light of God inside of them and are equal, and they're also pacifists. They also view being flashy and overly show-offy as sinful. The Quakers established a holy experiment in Pennsylvania, as they called it, in which it was one of two places in the world with total religious freedom. There was universal suffrage, or all men could vote. They were very quick to ban slavery, the first place in the world, and there was no ruling or priest class. They welcomed immigrants from all over, and Pennsylvania was a multicultural, very free society. This society is built around churches in which people's social networks was based around what kind of church they went to, whether Presbyterian, Lutheran, Quaker, Episcopalian, Catholic, etc. Something else to keep in mind was that even though there was a lot of diversity, this was mostly between white Protestants of Northwestern European ancestry. The idea in this part of the country the Quakers developed is that everyone has the right to do what they'd like, as long as they're not bothering anyone else's freedom. This idea of freedom gradually took over all of America and the rest of the world. Pennsylvania and New England were the first two places to industrialize in America, and Pennsylvania very rapidly became very wealthy and populous, since the Quakers were very capitalist and very pro-business. The foundry had been America's most mercantile and prosperous area since the colonial era. As the foundry expanded west into the Midwest and the Great Lakes, it was able to become so prosperous and wealthy by combining good institutions, hardworking peoples, and really good geography. This culture also expanded into Ontario in Canada, which was populated by loyalists from Pennsylvania and New York, giving the area a very similar culture to the American side of the border. The foundry is really geographically blessed with the most fertile soil and the most temperate climate east of the Mississippi, very abundant rainfall, the Great Lakes and the greater Mississippi River system, as well as the Atlantic coast, and massive coal and a little bit of oil deposits. The three advantages of institutions, culture, and geography meant that this was the dominant area in most of American history. When you look at standard American culture like the accent, food, architecture, and the like that's considered normal American rather than regional, you're looking at the culture of Pennsylvania and New York State, since this area maintained cultural dominance for so long. Standard American culture is a combination of Quaker, Yankee, and German influences in western Pennsylvania and New York, who formed a pluralistic society with hard work and industrial and capitalist dynamic societies. America is kind of strange, where in most cases, the imperial core or heartland of the empire, people tend to be very cold and impersonal, selfish, and arrogant. But the culture of the foundry is naturally very friendly and open, family-oriented, and generally socially conservative. At the same time, you also see peoples in imperial heartlands become decadent, but people in this country are also fairly tough. When people think of American small towns of friendly, down-to-earth people, they're thinking of this region. Even today, this is the most politically important area of America. Being stuck geographically between New England and the South, it gets to decide which side in that struggle wins. At the same time, the Quaker heritage forces it to choose between its strongly libertarian side that really distrusts governments, and as well as its general social modesty and conservatism against its social sense of duty, large cities, and ethnic minorities that tilt it left. In a lot of ways, each presidential election is a battle for this region's vote, with two of the most important swing states, Pennsylvania and Ohio, in it. For the 100 years after the U.S. Civil War, the foundry treated the rest of the country as a colony. Resources extracted in the South and the West like cotton, steel, lumber, oil, and everything else were processed in the foundry. All the major corporations were centered in this region, with Philadelphia, Chicago, and New York banks or railroads having tentacles extending out to dominate and in many ways exploit the rest of the continent. However, after a certain point, the foundry started to fall really hard and became the Rust Belt, which happened for a variety of reasons, partially related to the hubris of their long-standing dominance. One of which, for lack of a better term, is ethnic problems. To be brutally honest, the successful immigrants assimilated into local American culture, and the unsuccessful ones stayed in the industrial cities, attaching their identities to corrupt labor unions that seized control of the governments, and then deindustrialized those cities in effect. Before we continue, I want to say I have nothing against unions. They've done wonderful things around the world in history, and they've helped out Americans a lot in tremendous ways. But in this particular instance, the unions became extremely corrupt and were the biggest thing killing this region. In Philadelphia, for example, they totally dominate the politics, always choosing who wins elections, literally having thugs beat up their opponents. They corruptly siphon away massive amounts of city funds to their own pockets while keeping taxes and corruption high, which doesn't encourage businesses or innovation.
The ethnic problem was that almost all the business owners were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and the unions were mostly people of Catholic or black origin. None of these cultures were places where the average person was a stakeholder or involved in the capitalist economy. And so that created a very poisonous dynamic where the unions that seized power had no understanding of the kind of market forces that drove that area's success in the first place. This resulted in the creation of anti-business policies, and thus the mass eviction of industry to the states to the south and west.
This may sound like a racist or rightist rant, but if you look at these cities honestly, it's totally obvious. For the 300-year period where Philadelphia was run by pro-business Protestants, it was one of the world's greatest industrial centers, and within 10 years of the rise of Catholic unions, it lost almost all its industry, which never returned. And I mean, also on a purely local level, you'll see in cities like Philadelphia or Detroit that businesses, when they move locally rather than across region, they will just moved to a neighboring suburb that never had this rise of corrupt unions. These unions had a vaguely socialist view of the world, and so viewed money as a pie to divide rather than something that's created, and so didn't realize that they were just making everyone poorer with these policies. They resulted in starving these areas of jobs and opportunities, and thus a mass diaspora left the Rust Belt for states to the south and the west. There's a couple stories of Philadelphia teams playing in Los Angeles, and more Philadelphia fans in Los Angeles cheer on the Philly team than native Los Angelites do. People realize that this is a no-growth strategy, but the people who don't like it leave, which creates a selection pressure for the people who support the status quo. The best way to describe the Foundry is that we're the vanilla faction in a video game. The Foundry has so much going for it, but it doesn't have New England's intellectual abilities, the South's cheapness, and the cavalier spirit, or the sheer size of the West. And so as we moved into a more globalized age where people with extreme abilities did better, the Foundry was screwed. Although the Foundry was already losing jobs to other parts of America before the 80s, but once globalization happened and they were competing against Mexico or China, it fell into a full rout and this area fell even further. There was a massive migration of black Americans from the South around World War II, and the Foundry had no idea on how to deal with it. This was partially due to massive racism on the part of the whites, but also that the black Americans didn't have the skills or education to adapt to how America was turning out as a society. This means the Foundry is populated by heartbreaking black ghettos. These places have horrifyingly high crime and murder rates, very little social opportunity, educational standards that are straight up third world, horrible food supply, majorities of families broken, and really are third world places. The really sad thing is that they're next to communities that are incredibly safe, wealthy, well-educated, and everything else. If you grew up in the Foundry, you just learn to accept this, since so many things have been tried and failed. Our leaders aren't especially forward-thinking how to deal with it either. You come to accept some areas are third world next to first world areas, even if it is truly, truly unfair. The future of the Foundry doesn't look so positive now. There's no forward-thinking group of leaders in this region who will lead it into the future. This area of the country basically exports skilled, enterprising young people, so there's massive brain drain. The new gains in America are going to its south and west, and the horrifying thing is that the elite in this area is so complacent that it just pretends the losses have never happened at all and things are still as great as the 50s. However, in the long picture, I'm still optimistic on this region. It has so many advantages, whether a skilled, educated, and hard-working population, fertile lands, temperate climate, and good geography, that once its elite is gone and the wheel of history will turn in another direction, I'm confident the Rust Belt will be the Foundry again.
Number 3, the South. The South is the most enigmatic region in America. It's the only regional culture that was powerful enough that it actively tried to form its own country at some point. It's a regional culture that's so powerful that many people question if they're really Americans, but fundamentally, at the same time, the South is the most American part of the country. There are two places to start with the South: its geography and its people. In both cases, the South is divided between two regions, the coast and the interior. So much so that it's not even useful at times to count the South as a single region. You can honestly split the South into 5 or 6 or more regions, but that's making things needlessly complicated for this video. However, the broader reality of the coastal South is disease. It annoys me when people like real-life lore Peter Zeihan act as if America has perfect geography, and I think to myself, that's only the case because we've been able to engineer our way out of the worst aspects of our geography. In the South's case, it was disease. Most of the American South sits at the latitude of Africa, which gives the region a subtropical climate. Until 100 years ago, this meant for white people who did not evolve for tropical climates, the disease was extremely deadly in the coastal South. And a lot of times, majorities of newcomers would die upon arriving. In a lot of ways, it's really shocking that a European civilization at all was able to transpose itself onto an area with alligators, water moccasins, palm trees, and terrain that looks straight out of Africa. The first settlers in the coastal South were Englishmen around the same time as New England, but the opposite demographic. The Royalists who settled Virginia came from Western England, a rural area that was very socially conservative and hierarchical. This would be the equivalent of if today there was a space colony settled by lefties and another one by righties, and over the next couple hundred years they evolved into their own societies. Like the South today, Southern England was known for being rural, hickish, obsessed with nobility, slow-moving, charming, and yet bigoted. Like Pennsylvania and New England, the founders viewed themselves as building a utopia, but instead a conservative, aristocratic utopia. This was a split social group, combining the peasants and aristocrats of southwestern England, thus creating the South's class system of wealthy, cultured aristocrats and poor white trash, who were culturally totally different worlds, while in the rest of America, rich and poor have much smaller cultural differences between them. Today, the South is the lowest social mobility of any region in America.
An interesting digression is I was watching some videos online about how lower-class South English people act, and it came across to me as pretty similar to how Black Americans act. And I assumed due to the international popularity of Black Americans that they had taken it from American pop culture. But from talking to English people, I realized it's the other way around, where that group of English people immigrated to the American South, and because poor whites and blacks lived in such intimate conditions, Black Americans took up a lot of the cultural forms that came from South England.
Which leads me to the next section, in which the nobles who tried to establish their aristocratic paradise in the South wanted to use white labor as their peasants, but the whites refused to do so, and so the nobility started to import African slaves. This reached a fever pitch in the early 18th century, and black people became 1/3 of the South's population. The southern states of the South, or the Deep South, the black people were normally a majority, and in some areas like coastal South Carolina, they were around 80% of the population. White and black culture intermixed to a remarkable degree, with whites taking African religious, social, music, and other things, while black Americans were forced to take much of white culture as their African culture was erased. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the African Americans here since I covered them in this video, but they were brutally repressed in truly awful ways for centuries. The compromise of the Southern social code between lower and upper class whites was to oppress blacks. At the same time, the things that made the South economically viable, or its plantations that made tobacco, cotton, sugar, etc., were built off slavery. To reject white supremacy as a Southerner was to reject their entire way of life. For a century after slavery even ended, the whites legally kept black people subservient in almost every way, legally keeping them from voting, using the same schools, restaurants, or bathrooms, and lynching or doing vigilante hangings of those that tried to hurt the status quo in any way by even being successful or trying to vote. Slavery is one of the worst things you can do in a society for many reasons. There are so many that here's a text wall. However, the states that were most dependent on slavery were those that turned out by far the worst in America today. Slavery lowers hustle, initiative, social trust, which is, in this area, the worst in all of America. The South was dirt poor until it ended the laws discriminating against black people because their obsession with race was holding their entire society down. New England was an ethno-state, the foundry was a culturally similar pluralist society, while the South was a split society. White Southerners who were predominantly British origin viewed their primary identity as being white and put themselves in stark opposition to the other who were blacks. These two groups have not mixed across American history, being distinct castes, where it was even illegal for them to mix together in a marriage. The rule in the South was that if a person had a single drop of black blood, or was 1/16 black, they were totally black, and should be treated legally and socially as such. The second South is the Upper South. This was populated by people from Scotland to Northern Ireland who had a warrior herding culture. They immigrated as clans and tribes, settling a 1,000-mile area from Pennsylvania to Georgia. Since they were predominantly small-level farmers and herders, they settled extremely lightly, never engaging in commerce or trade. This, combined with their military ability to fight the Indians, meant they were the bulwark against the Indians and pushing the American frontier forward very quickly. They came from stubborn, freedom-loving cultures and gave America its country music and cowboy culture, spreading west across the upper South out to Texas, Kansas, and New Mexico. A lot of this cultural area also dominates the southern halves of Midwestern states like Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri, who all sympathize with the Confederacy heavily and are basically cultural extensions of the South. The Upper South didn't have the alligators and disease of the Lower South, and was overwhelmingly white and more temperate. This is the South you'll hear about in country music. The final and pretty marginal culture of the South is French Louisiana, which was settled by people from French Canada who were evicted by the English. The climate here was the worst of anywhere disease-wise for white Americans in the U.S., and so before the U.S. colonization was close to 80% black. Louisiana became split between an Anglo-North and a French South after it was annexed by the U.S., and French Louisiana is best viewed as a cultural extension of a Caribbean nation like Haiti. The South, between the lower class and aristocrat English, Africans, and Scots-Irish, developed a couple defining cultural factors that powerfully drove its entire cultural history. The first is that none of these groups came from cultures that were well glued into the modern world and capitalism. Because of this, until around World War II, the South had a reputation for having an inindustrious and inefficient work culture. The flip side is that this region is known for being incredibly kind and charming, but also it's been the poorest region in America and lowest in every single human development index for all of American history. The genius German historian Oswald Spengler had this idea that there's culture and civilization. The idea is that civilization gradually consumes a culture, and as people become more civilized over thousands of years, they lose their ability to create and innovate, because they stop being in touch with themselves and more their cultural identities. Barbarians can be more creative since they're closer to the earth. The other genius historian, Amaury de Riencourt, said that the reason so much of American culture comes out of the South, whether country, rock, soul, jazz, and the like, as well as so many charismatic politicians and warriors across American history, is the South's origins in tribal and lower-class peoples. This is also why black Americans have been so culturally powerful around the world, even though they faced so much discrimination. The elite were aristocrats, and aristocrats have always shunned work and innovation as workmanlike. This meant the South had very few cities, no industry, no merchant class, or anything like that until World War II. All their trade was handled by people imported from New England or the foundry. I must also throw in that until air conditioning, the climate had made initiative difficult. I mean, anyone who's lived in a hot climate says it's really hard to be imaginative or wake up in the morning with hustle when it's just hot and humid every day. Due to the South being such a rural society, it wanted land, and so it expanded very rapidly west in the years of the early Republic. Actually, at twice the speed in square miles as the North did. However, the South started to get stuck right before the U.S. Civil War. The South wasn't able to expand geographically beyond Texas or the plains like the North was, since its agricultural style wasn't right for it, and the North's population was growing much faster due to immigration and industry, both of which the South entirely missed out on. The South started the Civil War since it realized that if population stats continued for the North, they would be able to peacefully abolish slavery by having just more people in the South democratically. Due to their martial warrior tradition, the South fought very well for having only half of the North's population, but in the end, the North ground the South down with its superior industry, numbers, and organization. The North abolished slavery, thus destroying the Old South's evil economy and social structure, and the South became an economic colony of the foundry. The South then did the worst possible thing as a reaction to the Civil War. They digged their heels in, were totally unwilling to look at the new world that existed. They created a nearly religious cult about how they lost the Civil War and nothing was their fault. They built their legal code around oppressing black people and did nothing to help create industry, obsessing over their way of life, not thinking critically about it. From 1865 to 1965, the South was viewed as nearly medieval by the rest of the country, or the land that time forgot, while the South remained desperately poor compared to the rest of the country. This in many ways is characteristic of the South, which has been the bulwark of America's conservatism in every single situation, and so it makes sense that the South would react to the Civil War in a conservative way. Whether or not it's been good or bad situationally, the South has always stood against New England's attempts to change the country. This is the most religious part of the country by far today, called the Bible Belt. Christianity here is a much louder, more public, more active, and aggressive presence than anywhere else in the country. Christianity hasn't been in decline here, instead it's been becoming more powerful. However, something surprising happened then. Once the rest of the country forced the South to end the discriminatory Jim Crow laws in the 1960s, the South experienced some of the fastest social and economic growth of anywhere in the world over the next 60 years. The South was very cheap and very pro-business, and so as the foundry was failing to deal with corrupt socialist governments, you saw an exodus of people from the foundry to the South by the million. Companies relocated south en masse, and these skilled Northerners built the New South, assimilated pretty rapidly into the South's charming culture. This was paralleled by the migration of half of the South's black population outwards, mostly to the foundry during the World War period. Poverty has collapsed in the South and cities have sprung up rapidly. The South is the most hopeful area of America. If you had to take bets on any of these nations for the future, it would be the South, which even now is experiencing rapid growth with no end in sight, currently at the expense of more liberal states like New York or California. If the Confederacy became a country today, it would be the third largest economy and most powerful military on the planet after China. The South still has problems. It's still the poorest part of the country with the worst education and has large amounts of inequality and antisocial behavior. Yet it's also the most optimistic part of America. The South seems to have gotten past racism, scoring no worse than the rest of the country in objective measurements, as well as just what I've heard anecdotally. Southerners of all backgrounds, races, and regions are rushing headlong to the future. After a century of humiliations, the South is the area with the most asabiya or will in America today.
It reminds me of something my dad said, where my dad's a baby boomer, and Southerners in his youth would say, the South's going to do it again, or the South's going to rebel and try to form an independent country again. And my dad's reply back in the day was, do it and we'll beat the shit out of you again. But my dad said, first of all, the Southerners don't say that anymore, and second of all, if they said it, I'd be scared because this time they'd win. Number 4, the islands. The story of this cultural region is the story of really a single city and what feeds into it and what it symbolizes, and that dazzling world city is Miami. A little over 100 years ago, Miami was a swampland. What happened in between? The West Indies have a long and fascinating history, but the truth is that these were pretty unimportant areas until pretty recently. The Spanish refer to this region as the Useless Islands. Puerto Rico and Cuba were extremely lightly populated and mostly forest into the 20th century. Florida, meanwhile, was a giant alligator-infested swamp into the middle of the 20th century, with incredibly low population. Florida was opened up in the middle of the 20th century by various engineering projects that were able to drain the massive swamp in Florida. Also, the American South became cleaned of diseases like malaria, dengue, yellow fever, and stuff at around World War I. All of this stuff opened up Florida for settlement from other areas, mainly the northern states. This giant opening of land meant that there were lots of opportunities in Florida. When people say Florida and California seem similar, that's since they were populated at the same time. There's this whole stereotype of the Florida man, or that the craziest possible things happen in Florida. This is since Florida had so many opportunities that the weirdest people who couldn't make it anywhere else in the country went there. At the same time, the cultural influence from the Deep South meant that education was worse than it probably should have been. Florida was opened up by New York interests. The South was so culturally inert in the early 20th century that it's shocking how southern Florida was established by Northerners, but it was. Wealthy New Yorkers, and later especially Jews, would spend their winters in southern Florida and established Miami as a vacation city. Florida is known for various social communities that pick different parts of the peninsula, whether Jews, Midwesterners, the elderly, etc. For Americans from the Foundry or New England, Florida is our California, a warm climate where we don't subconsciously worry about starving over the winter. Florida is the land of vacations and craziness, with amusement parks that try to bring us into fantasy worlds and beaches with warm water that makes us feel like we're in the embryo again. Part of the mystery of Miami is it's where two different civilizations and worlds clash. We have the one coming down from the Yankee North and a second coming up from the Latin South. In the 60s, when Castro rose to power in Cuba, Castro evicted Cuba's upper classes, who then fled right across the strait to Miami, thus effectively colonizing the city and turning it into an extension of Latin America. When I went to Miami, I was shocked many of the cashiers at shops couldn't speak even basic English. Across history, upper classes, upon losing everything, pretty regularly are able to make it back if given the opportunity. Miami became a very wealthy city from taking this Latin business elite. Likewise, since the ruling classes had been evicted by the communists, they had a very pro-business hustler spirit. The city became split between two civilizations, Latin and Western, as a veritable collaboration video, taking the best aspects of both. It took the wealth, stable institutions, business skill, and entrepreneurial spirit of Anglo civilization, with the flair, fun, and energy of Latin. It's a world city with connections all over the planet, since by being forced to have different civilizations collaborate, it had to have wide horizons. My father once described Miami as the safest and most civilized part of Latin America. Wealthy Latin Americans use Miami as their hub for everything, whether real estate, shopping, business, flights, and the like. Latin culture, especially music, is really based out of Miami. Although on this map the islands is the smallest region, in some ways it's by far the largest. The islands is really hard to map or to say what its population is, because the only area that I definitely put as the islands is southern Florida and the Bahamas. With areas like Cuba, Venezuela, and stuff, they're dependent upon the islands in many ways, but they're also their own thing. And I view it kind of like Carthage, where back in the ancient world, Carthage was this city-state that had trade connections all over in Spain and North Africa, in Italy, and you'd have a Carthaginian port, but then the local culture would still be different. And so, in this way, Miami has tendrils all over the Caribbean while being its own culture. I'd say the Bahamas is part of this island's culture to a very deep degree, because this is something folks don't know. The Bahamas is in a lot of ways a cultural extension of America, because it was settled by loyalists after the American Revolution who brought American slaves. And as of now, the Bahamanian economy is totally dependent on the American economy for tourism. And especially, it's a subsidiary of Florida, it's also English-speaking, and better seen as part of American black culture than anything else. For the US, Miami is a way of gradually spreading our values peacefully through Latin America indirectly. Also, Miami is a demonstration that there's nothing wrong with Latin culture in of itself, since under American rule they can flourish tremendously. However, the governments are at blame for Latin America's poverty, as I talk about in this video. If Latin America ever moves forward, it will come from these border areas between it and Anglo civilization, which will gradually bleed into improving Latin America. Miami's tendrils spread across the broader region. Venezuelan and Colombian cocaine was shipped through Miami, for example, and this cultural area is spreading. When I lived in Playa del Carmen outside Cancun in Mexico, it almost seemed like a copy and paste of Miami, with the same party, Latin, Anglo hybrid culture. I joked the town I lived in Mexico was a less Hispanic version of Miami. Miami, as of now, seems to be a city of the future. The one thing holding it back is that it's the first place to sink if climate change goes bad. The city is seeing a giant migration of educated labor, becoming a massive tech center especially. People who are tired of overpriced and zealous Los Angeles, New York, or SF have immigrated to the cheaper and more pleasant Miami. I literally get calls a couple times a month, people saying, "Why aren't you in Miami now?" Or "Why are you still in the Northeast?" To which my reply is, I love the foundry and I'm not ready to leave yet. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Alternately, check out my Pearl, Pillar, or Patreon. As always, thanks for watching and have a wonderful day.